On the evening of October 14th, 1938, the temperature in Upper Manhattan had dropped to 41 degrees. The wind came off the Harlem River in long, steady pulls that swept down the numbered streets and scattered newspapers along the curbs. On Lenox Avenue, between 131st and 135th Streets, the lights of the restaurants and social clubs burned against the early dark. It was a Friday. Men in overcoats and pressed hats moved between the barber shops and the pool halls. Women in wool coats and church shoes walked home from the garment factories south of 125th Street, where they had spent the day stitching collars onto shirts they could not afford to buy. The jazz clubs would not come alive for another 2 hours. The block was in the state it occupied every Friday evening at dusk, tired from the week, anticipating the night, unaware that anything was about to change. Our Ellsworth Jeffries, known to everyone north of 110th Street simply as L, sat in the back booth of a restaurant called Monroe's on 134th Street. He was 40 years old. He wore a dark gray suit, a white shirt with no tie, and a pair of black shoes that had been resoled twice. The bump on the left side of his jaw, where a man had hit him with a pipe wrench in 1929, had never properly healed, and it gave his face an asymmetry that people remembered. He was not a large man. He stood 5 feet 8 inches and weighed perhaps 160 pounds. His hands were clean, his nails were trimmed. He held a cup of coffee in his right hand and a folded copy of the Amsterdam News in his left, and he read without speaking to anyone. L. Jeffries had come to Harlem from Beaufort, South Carolina, when he was 12 years old. His mother had sent him north in 1910 after his father was beaten by 3 white men outside a feed store for failing to step off the sidewalk quickly enough. His father survived but walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and his mother decided that her son would not grow up in a place where a black man could be crippled for occupying a public sidewalk. She sent him to live with an aunt on 128th Street. He arrived with a cloth suitcase, a Southern accent that took him years to shed, and an understanding, absorbed not through instruction but through observation, that the world was organized to diminish him, and that his survival depended on understanding the organization. By the age of 16, L was running numbers for a woman named Odessa Pratt, one of the independent bankers who operated the illegal lottery that sustained much of Harlem's economy. By 20, he had his own small operation. By 25, he had been to prison twice, once for assault, once for a gambling charge that was almost certainly manufactured by a police captain he had refused to pay. By 30, he was one of perhaps a dozen men in Harlem whose name meant something beyond his own block. He was not the most powerful, he was not the most feared, but he was known for a quality that was rarer than either power or fear. He thought before he acted, and when he acted, he did not act twice. On this particular Friday evening, a man named Curtis Odom came through the door of Monroe's at approximately 6:15. Odom was one of L's runners, a thin, nervous man of about 25 who collected bets from a circuit of apartment buildings on the west side of Lenox Avenue. He walked directly to L's booth, and the expression on his face was enough to make the 2 men sitting at the counter near the door stop their conversation and look up. Odom did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the booth and spoke quietly. What he said, according to the account that later circulated through the neighborhood, was that a group of men, white men, between 30 and 50 of them, had been seen gathering in a warehouse on the northern edge of the Bronx, near the Westchester County line. They were wearing plain clothes, but several of them had been observed carrying bundles of white fabric. They had arrived in a convoy of automobiles. And a man who worked as a janitor in a building near the warehouse had overheard enough of their conversation to understand that they intended to drive south into Harlem that night, park their vehicles on the avenues above 135th Street, and march through the neighborhood carrying torches and a wooden cross. The janitor was a man named Horace Bell. He was 62 years old. He had come to New York from Alabama in 1918. He had seen cross burnings as a child, 3 of them, and in 3 different towns, and he knew what the white fabric meant. He had walked to a telephone in a drugstore on Boston Road and called the only number he could think of, which belonged to his nephew, who worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant on 132nd Street, who in turn had told Curtis Odom, who had come to Monroe's. L. Jeffries listened to all of this without interrupting. He set his coffee cup down. He folded his newspaper and placed it on the table. And then he sat in silence for what Odom later described as a long time, perhaps a full minute, perhaps longer, before he said anything at all. What happened in Harlem that night has been told in many different versions over the decades that followed. Some versions exaggerate. Some invent details that could not have occurred. What follows is the version that hews most closely to the accounts that were passed down through the families of the men who were there, with the understanding that oral history is an imperfect vessel and that certainty about the details of a single night 80 years ago is not possible. The first thing L. Jeffries did was nothing. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He did not send Odom to gather men with weapons. He sat in his booth and he thought. The men at the counter, who had overheard fragments of the conversation, waited for a reaction, a flash of anger, a barked command, something that matched the urgency of what Odom had described. They received none. L sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes focused on something that was not in the room, and he thought. What he was thinking, or what he later explained he had been thinking, was not about the men in the warehouse. It was about what the men in the warehouse represented. A group of 40 white men driving into Harlem to burn a cross was not, in L. Jeffries's understanding, a spontaneous act of hatred. A spontaneous hatred did not organize convoys. It did not stockpile robes. It did not select dates and times and routes. What Odom had described was planned. It was coordinated. And anything that was planned and coordinated had a purpose beyond the act itself. The purpose, as L understood it, was not to harm any particular individual. It was to deliver a message. The message was that Harlem was not sovereign, that its streets were not its own, and that the same forces that had broken his father's leg on a sidewalk in Beaufort could reach north across 1,000 miles and 2 decades and break something here as well. The cross was not an attack on a block. It was an attack on the idea that a black neighborhood could govern itself, could operate its own economy, maintain its own social order, and exist without the permission of white men. L. Jeffries had spent 28 years in Harlem. He had watched the white mob try to take the numbers racket. He had watched the police shake down every black business on the avenue. He had watched landlords charge double rent for apartments with no heat. He had fought some of these battles and lost most of them. But he had never lost the understanding that every individual insult was connected to every other individual insult by a system of assumptions about who had the right to occupy space and who did not. The men in the warehouse were not coming to Harlem because they hated L. Jeffries. Most of them had probably never heard his name. They were coming because they believed they could, because they believed that a black neighborhood, no matter how large or how organized, would scatter before 40 white men in white robes the same way a black man in Beaufort would step off a sidewalk to let a white man pass. The cross-burning was not about fire. Now it was about the assumption that Harlem would behave the way the South had taught white men to expect black communities to behave, with fear, with retreat, with the lowered eyes of people who understood their place. L. Jeffries understood all of this in the minute he sat in silence, and he understood something else as well, that if he responded with violence, if he sent armed men to the Bronx to intercept the convoy, if he ambushed the marchers on a side street, if he turned the night into a battle, he would confirm every assumption the men in the warehouse had made about what Harlem was. He would give them their war. He would give the police their excuse. He would give the newspapers their headline. And the headline would not read that white men had invaded a black neighborhood. The headline would read that black criminals had attacked white citizens. He knew this because he knew how the world worked. He had always known. So he chose a different response. And the execution of that response over the next 4 hours was the most precisely orchestrated act of his career. The first person L sent for was a woman named Dolores Vance. Dolores was 53 years old. She had been born in Harlem, which made her unusual. Most of the neighborhood's residents were migrants from the South or the Caribbean. She ran a boarding house on 133rd Street that was, in practice, the social center of a network that extended into every church, every mutual aid society, and every women's club between 125th and 145th Streets. Dolores Vance knew everyone. More precisely, she knew every woman in Harlem who organized anything, and those women collectively knew every family on every block. If you wanted to reach the neighborhood, you did not go to the politicians. You did not go to the ministers, although the ministers were important. You went to Dolores Vance. Because Dolores Vance could put a message into every apartment in Harlem in under 2 hours. The second person L sent for was a man named Reverend Charles T. Whitmore, who led the congregation at Mercy Baptist Church on 137th Street. Whitmore was a careful man, a man of public respectability, and he was not comfortable with L. Jeffries. He considered L. a criminal, which L. was, and he considered the numbers racket a moral stain on the neighborhood, which it may have been. But Whitmore was also a practical man, and he understood that in a crisis, respectability was a tool, not a principle. If white men marched through Harlem, and the response came only from the underworld, the story would be about black criminality. If the response came from the churches, the story would be about something else entirely. The third person L sent for was a man named Solomon Burke, and who was not a community leader or a minister, but a longshoreman who worked the docks on the Hudson River waterfront. Burke was the informal head of a group of approximately 200 black dock workers who loaded and unloaded cargo ships 6 days a week. These men were not organized into a formal union. The existing longshoremen's unions were segregated and hostile to black members. But they had their own structure, their own loyalty, and their own understanding of collective action. They also had something else. They were physically imposing men who spent their days lifting heavy objects, and they were accustomed to standing in large groups in all weather conditions without complaint. The fourth person L sent for was a man named Dr. Roscoe Patterson, a dentist with an office on 7th Avenue who also served as the Harlem correspondent for a black newspaper published in Philadelphia. Patterson owned a camera. More importantly, he understood the power of documentation. A photograph of white-robed men marching through a black neighborhood would mean one thing. A photograph of a black neighborhood standing in silent, disciplined formation while white-robed men turned around and left would mean something entirely different. Each of these people arrived at Monroe's restaurant within the hour. It was now approximately 7:15 in the evening. L. Jeffries had drunk 2 more cups of coffee. He had not eaten. He had not raised his voice. He explained what Horace Bell had reported. He did not editorialize. He did not appeal to emotion. He laid out the information as if he were describing the weather, and then he explained what he wanted to do. The strategy was simple in its conception and extraordinarily difficult in its execution. L did not want to stop the march. He wanted to let the march come to him. He wanted the men in white robes to drive into Harlem, to park their automobiles, to assemble on the avenue, and to begin their procession. And he wanted them to find, when they turned the corner onto the block they had selected for their demonstration, that the block was already occupied, not by armed men, not by a mob, by residents, by the people who lived on that block and the blocks around it. Men, women, and some older children, standing on the sidewalks, on the stoops, in the doorways of their apartment buildings, silent, unmoving, watching. The effect he was after was not confrontation. It was presence. He wanted the men in white robes to understand that they had not arrived in a neighborhood of scattered, frightened individuals. They had arrived in a neighborhood that had been expecting them, that had organized itself, that was standing in the dark, in the cold, watching them, and that the watching itself was the response. Dolores Vance left Monroe's first. She walked to her boarding house and began making telephone calls. Within 30 minutes, the message had reached the presidents of 4 women's clubs, the organizers of 2 church auxiliaries, and the heads of 3 mutual aid societies. The message was specific. Every able-bodied adult on the blocks between 131st and 138th Streets, from Lenox Avenue to 7th Avenue, was asked to be standing outside their building by 9 o'clock that evening. They were asked to bring no weapons. They were asked to make no noise. They were asked simply to stand. Reverend Whitmore returned to Mercy Baptist, where a Friday evening Bible study was already in session. He canceled the study and explained in broad terms what was happening. He asked the members of his congregation who lived nearby to go home, put on their coats, and stand outside. He asked them to tell their neighbors. He asked them to be calm. Solomon Burke went to a bar on 8th Avenue where many of the dock workers spent their Friday evenings, and he spoke to the men there in the plain language of working people. He did not dramatize. He told them what was coming, and he told them where to be. Within an hour, more than 100 longshoremen had left the bar and begun walking east toward Lenox Avenue. Dr. Patterson went home, retrieved his camera, loaded it with film, and stationed himself on the roof of a 5-story apartment building on 135th Street, from which he could see the full length of the block below. By 8:30, the first residents began appearing on the sidewalks. They came out of their buildings in 1s and 2s. A man in a heavy coat, a woman in a shawl, a couple standing together on a stoop. They did not gather in clusters. They did not talk loudly. They stood where they lived, in front of their own doors, and they waited. By 9 o'clock, the numbers were impossible to ignore. On the 4 blocks between 131st and 135th along Lenox Avenue, there were people standing on both sides of the street for the entire length of every block. Later estimates would vary. Some who were there said 200, some said 300. Solomon Burke, who had spent his career counting men on a loading dock, said it was closer to 400, and that more were arriving every few minutes. They stood in the dark. The streetlights cast long pools of yellow on the pavement, but between the pools the sidewalks were deep in shadow, and the people standing in those shadows were visible only as silhouettes. The shapes of coats and hats, the occasional glow of a cigarette, the faint vapor of breath in the cold air. They did not chant. They did not sing. Some of the women prayed quietly, but even the prayers were murmured so softly that they could not be heard from more than a few feet away. The dominant sound on Lenox Avenue at 9 o'clock on the evening of October 14th, 1938, was silence. L. Jeffries stood on the corner of 134th Street and Lenox Avenue. He wore his gray suit and no hat. His hands were in his coat pockets. He did not speak to the people around him. He watched the avenue to the north, where the headlights of automobiles occasionally swept past on their way to or from the Bronx. He waited. At approximately 9:40, a convoy of 7 automobiles turned south off of 138th Street onto Lenox Avenue. They moved slowly, in a single column, their headlights cutting through the dark. The lead vehicle was a black Ford sedan. The others were a mix of Fords and Chevrolets, the ordinary cars of ordinary men. They drove south at perhaps 15 miles an hour, and as they crossed 137th Street, the men inside them began to see what was waiting. The sidewalks were full. On both sides of the avenue, for as far as the headlights could reach, people were standing in the dark. They were not blocking the road. They were not approaching the vehicles. They were simply there, hundreds of them, motionless, watching the convoy pass with an attention that was absolute and unbroken. The lead vehicle slowed, then it slowed further. At 136th Street, it stopped. For a long moment, witnesses would later disagree on whether it was 30 seconds or 3 minutes. The convoy sat in the middle of Lenox Avenue with its engines running. The men inside the cars could see the sidewalks, they could see the stoops, they could see the doorways. Every surface that a human being could stand on was occupied. The faces that looked back at them were calm. No one shouted, no one threw anything, no one moved toward the cars. What the men in the convoy had expected was an empty street, a sleeping neighborhood, a few scattered pedestrians who would flee at the sight of white robes and a burning cross. What they found was a community that had been waiting for them, that was standing in organized formation and in disciplined silence in the cold, in the dark. And that was making it plain, without a single word or a single gesture of aggression, that this street was occupied, that these blocks were claimed, and that the performance the men in the cars had planned to deliver would not be delivered to an empty theater. From his position on the rooftop, Dr. Patterson began taking photographs. At the flash of his camera was visible from the street, a brief white flare against the dark sky, and the men in the cars could not have missed it. They were being documented. Whatever they did next would be recorded. The lead vehicle sat at 136th Street for what witnesses estimated was 2 to 3 minutes. Then its reverse lights came on. It backed up slowly, turned east onto 136th, and headed toward the river. One by one, the other vehicles followed. The last car in the convoy, a green Chevrolet with a dented front fender, paused at the corner for a few seconds longer than the others. Then it, too, turned and disappeared into the dark. The march never happened. No cross was burned, no robes were worn, no torches were lit. The men in the cars drove back to the Bronx, and from there, presumably, to wherever they had come from. There is no record of what they said to each other on the drive home.
There is no record of whether they attempted to return on a subsequent night. They did not. On the sidewalks of Lenox Avenue,
The people of Harlem remained standing for another 20 minutes after the last car had gone. No one gave a signal to leave. No one announced that the danger had passed. They simply stood as if the standing itself had become the point, as if the act of occupying their own street in silence, in the cold, had taken on a significance that outlasted the specific threat that had occasioned it. Then, gradually, they began to go inside. A woman on 133rd Street was the first to move, turning and climbing the steps to her building without a word. Others followed. By 10:30, the avenue was quiet again, and Harlem looked as it always looked on a Friday night in October. The clubs coming alive, the restaurants filling up, the low sound of a trumpet drifting from an open window on 132nd Street. L. Jeffries went back to Monroe's. He sat in his booth. He ordered a plate of chicken and rice and a cup of coffee, and he ate his dinner alone. In the days that followed, the night became the subject of conversation across the neighborhood, although the conversations were conducted in the understated manner that characterized Harlem's relationship with its own history. People did not celebrate what had happened. They noted it. They mentioned it to their neighbors, to their co-workers, and to the family members they telephoned on Sunday evenings. They said that something had happened on Lenox Avenue on Friday night, and that the something had amounted to a group of white men who came to Harlem with bad intentions and left with nothing accomplished, and that the reason they left was that the neighborhood had been standing in the street when they arrived. There was no victory parade. There were no speeches on a stage. There was no moment in which the community paused to recognize what it had done. This was deliberate, though the deliberation was not discussed. The people who had stood on Lenox Avenue understood, without needing to articulate it, that what they had done was significant precisely because it was quiet. A loud victory would have invited scrutiny. It would have attracted the attention of the police, who would have wanted to know who organized the gathering and why. It would have attracted the attention of the press, which would have reduced the event to a headline. A confrontation, a near riot, a clash between races, and in doing so would have stripped it of the quality that made it powerful, its restraint. The people of Harlem had not rioted. They had not fought. They had stood, and the standing, in its silence and its discipline, had said everything that needed to be said. The story did not make the white newspapers. It did not make most of the black newspapers either, because what had happened was, in a certain light, a non-event. A march that did not take place, a confrontation that was averted, a threat that dissolved on contact with an organized response. Dr. Patterson's photographs, which he developed in a dark room on 130th Street the following morning, showed the convoy of automobiles on a dark avenue flanked by rows of standing figures, but the images were grainy and poorly lit and did not convey the scale of what they depicted. He published two of them in the Philadelphia paper, accompanied by a short article that described the events in restrained language. The article was not widely read, but within Harlem, the night became something else. It became a reference point, a shared memory that functioned as a kind of civic scripture, invoked not in moments of celebration, but in moments of doubt. When the conversation turned, as it often did, to the question of what the neighborhood could accomplish if it acted together, a question that was debated in churches and social clubs and on street corners every day of the week, someone would mention the night on Lenox Avenue, and the mention would settle the debate, at least temporarily, because there was no theoretical argument that could match the concrete fact that 400 people had stood in the cold and turned back a convoy of men who had come to terrorize them. The night also changed something in the internal dynamics of the neighborhood, something subtle but consequential. Before October 14th, the various factions of Harlem's civic life had operated in largely separate spheres. The church people did not associate with the numbers men. The numbers men did not attend church functions. The women's clubs occupied a different social world from the dock workers, the professionals, the dentists, the teachers. The few lawyers who maintained practices in the neighborhood kept a careful distance from anyone whose income derived from illegal activity. These separations were not merely social, they were structural. They reflected a community that was, despite its density and its shared experience of racial oppression, deeply fragmented along lines of class, respectability, and moral judgment. The night on Lenox Avenue did not erase these divisions. They persisted for decades and, in some form, persist to this day. But it demonstrated that the divisions could be bridged, that in a moment of genuine threat, the women who organized church auxiliaries could work alongside the man who ran a numbers operation, and the longshoreman could stand on the same sidewalk as the dentist, and none of them needed to surrender their principles or their identity in order to act as a single body. The night proved that coalition was possible. It did not prove that coalition was permanent. But possibility, in a neighborhood that had been told for generations that collective black action was impossible, was enough. The coalition that L. Jeffries had assembled that night did not dissolve when the cars left. It evolved. Dolores Vance's network of women's clubs and church auxiliaries became, over the next several years, the backbone of a series of rent strikes, consumer boycotts, and voter registration campaigns that challenged the white-owned businesses and absentee landlords who extracted wealth from the neighborhood without reinvesting it. The specific tactics varied. The underlying principle did not. The principle was that Harlem's power resided not in any individual, not in L. Jeffries, not in Reverend Whitmore, not in any politician or minister or racketeer, but in the collective capacity of its residents to organize, to show up, and to stand. Reverend Whitmore, who had been reluctant to work with L. Jeffries before the night of October 14th, continued to work with him afterward, not as a partner in the numbers racket, which he still opposed, but as a collaborator in the broader project of neighborhood defense. The two men did not become friends. They remained, in temperament and in moral outlook, fundamentally different people. But they shared an understanding that had been forged on Lenox Avenue, that in a crisis, the distinction between the respectable and the disreputable members of a community mattered less than the distinction between those who showed up and those who did not. Solomon Burke's dock workers, who had provided the physical mass that filled the blocks between 131st and 135th, became an informal security force for community events, not armed, not violent, but present, and their size and their discipline serving as a reminder that the neighborhood could mobilize a large number of disciplined men on short notice. Burke himself never joined any formal organization. He continued to work the docks until his retirement in 1957, but he was consulted, quietly and regularly, by community leaders who understood that the capacity to fill a street with men was a form of power that could not be purchased or legislated. L. Jeffries himself continued to operate in the space between the legal and the illegal that had defined his entire adult life. He ran his numbers operation. He paid off the police when he had to and fought them when he could. He distributed turkeys at Thanksgiving and coal in January and school supplies in September, and the people of the neighborhood accepted these gifts with the understanding that they came from a man who was neither a saint nor a hero, but who had demonstrated, on at least one occasion, the capacity to defend the place where they lived. He never spoke publicly about the night of October 14th. He never claimed credit for organizing the response. When people mentioned it in his presence, he listened without comment and changed the subject. This silence was not modesty. It was strategy. L. understood that the power of what had happened that night resided in its collective nature, in the fact that 400 people had stood in the cold, and not because one man had told them to, but because they understood, each individually and all together, that their presence was required. To claim the night as a personal achievement would have been to diminish it. It was not his night. It was theirs. The men who had driven the convoy into Harlem were never identified. Horace Bell, the janitor who had provided the initial warning, told anyone who asked that he had seen white fabric and heard talk of a march, but he could not identify any of the men by name. The automobiles had carried no distinctive markings. The license plates, which Dr. Patterson had tried to photograph from the rooftop, were illegible in the developed images. The men had come from somewhere outside the city, probably from Westchester or Connecticut, where small Klan chapters continued to operate throughout the 1930s, despite the organization's national decline. They had come to Harlem expecting to find what they had always found in their encounters with black communities: submission or chaos. They found neither. They found order. They found silence. They found 400 people who were not afraid of them, and they left. In the years that followed, Harlem continued to face the forces that had always besieged it: poverty, police brutality, exploitation by outside economic interests, and the slow devastation of narcotics that would accelerate through the 1950s and 1960s. The night of October 14th did not solve these problems. It did not even slow them down. What it did was provide an answer to a question that was fundamental to the neighborhood's sense of itself. Could Harlem act as a single body? Could its residents, fragmented by class, by origin, by legal and illegal occupations, by the 1,000 daily humiliations that made collective action seem impossible, come together when it mattered? The answer, on one cold Friday in October, had been yes. And that answer, however limited, however specific to the circumstances that produced it, entered the neighborhood's memory and remained there, a quiet, persistent reminder that the power to defend a community was not located in any institution or any individual, but in the willingness of ordinary people to stand on their own street in the dark and refuse to move. L. Jeffries died in the winter of 1961 of a heart ailment that had troubled him for years. He was 63 years old. His funeral was held at Mercy Baptist Church, where Reverend Whitmore, now 71 and largely retired, delivered the eulogy. The church was filled beyond its capacity of 300. People stood in the aisles, in the vestibule, and on the sidewalk outside. Among those in attendance were numbers runners and school teachers, bartenders and nurses, a retired judge, several police officers who had arrested L at various points over the preceding decades, and an 84-year-old janitor from the Bronx named Horace Bell, who sat in the back pew and said nothing to anyone. No one who spoke at the funeral mentioned the night of October 14th, 1938. No one needed to. The people in the church knew the story. They had been there, or their parents had been there, or they had grown up hearing about it from someone who had been there. The story did not need to be repeated. It needed only to be remembered. And in Harlem, where memory was the most reliable archive and the most powerful weapon, it was. Dolores Vance outlived L by 11 years. But she continued to operate her boarding house on 133rd Street until 1968, when the building was sold to a developer and converted into rental apartments. She moved to a smaller apartment on 140th Street, where she kept a rotary telephone that rang at all hours, with calls from women across the neighborhood seeking her advice on everything from tenant disputes to marital difficulties. She had no children of her own. She had, instead, a community, which was, she once told a young woman who was helping her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs, the same thing, only larger. Solomon Burke died in 1964. He was buried in a cemetery in Queens. 37 dock workers attended his funeral, along with their wives and children, and each of them placed a single coin on his coffin before it was lowered into the ground, a longshoreman's tradition whose origins no one could clearly explain. Dr. Roscoe Patterson moved to Chicago in 1947, where he continued to practice dentistry and to photograph the communities he lived in. His negatives from the night of October 14th, 11 exposures, most of them too dark to be useful, were stored in a shoebox in his office closet. After his death in 1972, his daughter donated the shoebox, along with several hundred other negatives, to a local historical society. The images have never been published. Reverend Charles T. Whitmore retired from Mercy Baptist in 1955. He died in 1966. In his papers, which were donated to the church after his death, there is a single reference to the night that mattered most. It appears in a handwritten note, undated, on the back of a church bulletin. The note reads, in its entirety, "They came, we stood, they left. The Lord does not require us to do more than stand. The avenue is still there. Lenox Avenue runs north through Harlem the way it always has, from 110th Street to the Harlem River. And the buildings on the blocks between 131st and 135th have changed. Some demolished, some renovated, some replaced by newer structures that bear no resemblance to what stood there in 1938. The restaurant called Monroe's closed decades ago. The church is still there. The street is still there. And beneath the street, In the memory of a neighborhood that has endured more than most neighborhoods should have to endure, there remains the faint, persistent trace of a night when the block was full of people who had no weapons and no signs and no leaders visible on any platform, who stood in the cold because standing was what was required, and who discovered, in the silence, in the dark, in the long minutes before the headlights appeared, and the longer minutes after they disappeared, that the simplest form of power is the refusal to be absent from your own life. No one recorded the names of all 400. No one could have. They were the people of the block, the residents, the workers, the women who stitched collars, the men who carried freight, the children who watched from upper windows, the old men who stood on stoops they had been standing on for 30 years. They were not heroes. They were present. And in the economy of power, presence, organized, silent, and immovable, was worth more than anything the men in the cars had brought with them. The cars did not come back. Harlem remained.